And hello and welcome back to another edition of Lifestream Ministries. And I'm your host, Lee Jenkins, and I'm glad you could join me today. I'm going to continue with a subject, a topic that Deb and I started last week, and that is one on prayer. And prayer is one of the core values for Christianity, one of the core values of maintaining our strength. And the Word says that if we remain connected to the vine, that's where we receive our strength, our power, our peace. That's what causes us to grow. So again, prayer is one of those things that is a indispensable component with having a strong Christian life, but it seems like it's one of those areas that a lot of Christians neglect or that they struggle with. And a lot of it is because of the teaching, and a lot of it is that somehow that prayer has been presented like this mystical thing, or that it's something that's difficult to do, or we don't use the right words, or we don't pray in the right manner. We don't pray like somebody else. And God's just calling us to be us. And I know when I pray, I don't pray in a King James language. I don't use the thee and thous. And the prayer is just a manner of communicating with God. It's a manner of communicating with our Father. And it's just part of the reconciliation that God intended when Jesus came, when his sinless life, his death, his resurrection was for the sole purpose of God reconciling us to himself. And that's what this entire book is about. And literally from beginning to end. And like I say, prayer is just a component of that. And when we look at primarily in the Old Testament, God was in this method, or was in this mode of nation building. There wasn't a lot of individualism. There wasn't a lot of individual relationship between God and a singular person. And so we had using, say, the nation of Israel as an example, the people would access God and access God's presence through the priest and through the daily sacrifices and the outer courts, and the way the sanctuary was set up, the temple was set up, the tabernacle was set up, that there was an outer court, an inner court, and then there was the Holy of Holies where God's presence resided. And at each step there had to be a different level of holiness and cleanliness, and to be able to step into God's presence. And that was only done once a year, and it was done by the high priest, and was only done after a time of serious cleansing to be able to step into God's presence. So this idea of prayer was one that was unique and was basically reserved for prophets and priests and kings, and that they were the mediaries or intermediaries between God himself and the people. And so it was through the prophets that God spoke. It was through the priests that the people approached God and had their sins not absolved but covered. And it was by the death of another animal in the people's place. And then that blood was sprinkled on the altar, and it was done in daily rituals that help cover the sins of people. And then you think of different kings, King Solomon, King David, who had a relationship, Abraham, Jacob, the patriarchs that had a relationship with God. Moses is another one that comes to mind that spoke directly with God. But like I say, it was primarily a task or a privilege of prophets and priests and kings. But when Jesus Christ came, that veil, the curtain that separated in the temple, separated the sanctuary from the Holy of Holies, was torn in two, and it was an example. It was a physical statement that God's presence was now among the people. And part of what we've seen when in Jesus' ministry is that he would separate himself from the crowd or from the people, from his disciples even, and he would get alone by himself to pray. But prayer even at that time was seen by the Pharisees, the religious upper class that would pray in public. But the disciples then asked Jesus to teach them to pray. So it was something that, and Jesus says that when you pray, so it's something that is expected, I believe. And like I say, it's something that is, it's a core value of this relationship, this communication that we have with Jesus Christ, and our relationship with him, and our walk, and what God has prepared for us, and just part of that daily thing, just like a human relationship that you would have with your spouse, your friends, there's an ongoing communication. And it's not something that you don't talk to your spouse or your best friend or your roommate. You don't talk to them, once a year or twice a year. It's something that it's an ongoing communication, and it, like I say, it's part of just biblical history. And last week, Deb and I got into this topic, and she mentioned this prayer of Jabez, and it's found in 1 Chronicle chapter 4, and it starts in verse 9. And I want to kind of pick back up on that because it's a prayer that most of us as Christians can relate to. And it starts in verse 9, and it says that there was a man named Jabez who was more honorable than any of his brothers, and his mother named him Jabez because his birth had been so painful. And he was the one who prayed to the God of Israel. So, and his prayer consisted of just two short lines. And again, like I said, that we, as most Christians, we can relate to this. And so I want you to listen up. And he says, oh, and he's praying to God, praying to the God of Israel. And he says, oh, that you would bless me and expand my territory, and please be with me in all that I do, and keep me from all trouble and pain. And like I said, that is a prayer that we can identify with, because that's one that we pray. God, I want you to bless me in everything that I do. I want you to expand my territory, that I need more stuff. I need a bigger house and a better job and more money and more toys. And so I want you to expand my territory. I want you to be with me in all that I do, as long as it's something that I want you to be in with me when I'm doing it. And then on the other side, we've got this secular side of us that we want to do our own thing, and we think we're doing it in private. But please be with me in all that I do. Keep me out of trouble, and keep me from all pain. And so the way I interpret that is that we want God's blessing on everything that we do, and we want more stuff, and that we want to be comfortable. And that is the American Christian's seems to be our mindset. And I know there's been a lot of preaching on the prosperity, and somehow that as we begin this walk with Christ, that somehow because we have Jesus Christ in our corner, that everything that He is going to do for us is going to bless us. But as we, as you read through the Bible, as you read through the New Testament, as you read through the troubles, the persecution that not only the New Testament church endured, but the apostles, as they carried the word, as they carried the gospel into the known world. And especially we think of the Apostle Paul, which wrote well over half the New Testament. It wasn't a life of prosperity. It was not a life of ease. It was not a life of comfort. And in fact, he proclaims that toward the end of his life is that he had ran hard after God, that he was finishing his race, and that at that very moment that he was being poured out like a drink offering, so that he had allowed himself to be used in any way, in any manner that God would see fit, and that God had poured him out, that there was nothing of human value that was left, but that he had given everything, all that he had, all that he was, for the furtherance of the gospel, that people might know Jesus Christ. And there was this prayer of Jabez, that there has been books written about it, but it's back to this, that there's a secret method, or there's a secret in this prayer, and it's a prayer that God always answers, and that's not the case. And I for one, I am kind of cautious when an author comes out and it's more about the book than it is about the word, and that there is some secret key, some secret code that they've picked up on something, or God has revealed something to them that nobody else has caught on to at the time. And so, like I say, that, and it does go on to say that God granted Jabez his request. But we find that I think it is, again, I'm cautious when we view that what God has done for one person, or the way God moves in one person's life, or a prayer that God answered in one person's life, can then be extrapolated into that's the way God's going to move in my circumstance. Because that is a definite recipe for disappointment and discouragement, that we begin to compare our life, our walk, our ministry, our family, our circumstances, our health, whatever it is, to somebody else's. And why does God grant them favor that he doesn't grant me? And so comparison is a killer. Comparison is, again, a way that the enemy can use it for discouragement, depression, that that the enemy can use to kind of twist us against God, or twist this idea that God is not necessarily for us, but he is against us. And so even though this is a prayer that Jabez prayed, it's not one I think that we can base all of our Christian walk. And I want to take us to another, I don't know if you would even really call it a prayer, but it is an early response by a prophet, and his name was Samuel when he was a young boy. And it is found in 1 Samuel chapter 3, and I want to start reading in verse 1, and I want to read through it a little bit, and I want you to note the difference of response between Jabez and Samuel's response. And so again, in 1 Samuel chapter 3, starting in verse 1, it says that meanwhile the boy Samuel, and Samuel is a little bit of background, his mother had been barren for years and prayed, and her request was that God grant her a son. And part of the bargain that she made was that she would bring the child back to God and would commit this child into God's service. So that's exactly what happened, and that she gave birth to Samuel, and that he was at some point that she brought him back to the temple and committed his life back to the service of the Lord. And so he was living there at the temple with the prophet who God was using at the time, and his name was Eli. So 1 Samuel 3:1, it says, meanwhile the boy Samuel served the Lord by assisting Eli, who was the prophet at the time. It says, now in those days messages from the Lord were very rare. Again, it wasn't that this idea of daily communion with God. And this was even a prophet, so it was rare that they heard from the Lord. So now in those days messages from the Lord were very rare, and visions were quite uncommon. And one night, Eli, who was almost blind by now, had gone to bed, and the lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was sleeping in the tabernacle near the ark of God. And so he was sleeping in the temple. And he was sleeping near the ark of God, and suddenly the Lord called out, Samuel. Yes, Samuel replied, what is it? And he got up and he ran to Eli, and here I am. Did you call me? And Eli, obviously being puzzled, he says, I didn't call you. Go back to bed. So he did, meaning Samuel. Then the Lord called out again, Samuel. And again, Samuel got up and went to Eli. Here I am. Did you call me? I didn't call you, my son, Eli said. Go back to bed. And Samuel did not yet know the Lord, because he had never heard a message from the Lord before. And so the Lord called a third time, and once more Samuel got up and went to Eli. Here I am. Did you call me? And then Eli realized that it was the Lord who was calling the boy. So he said to Samuel, go and lie down again, and if someone calls again, say, speak, Lord, your servant is listening. So Samuel went back to bed, and the Lord came and called as before, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel replied, speak, Lord, your servant is listening. And then the Lord then begins to speak to him, and it was the first time in Jesus in the New Testament, he says that my sheep know my voice and they follow me. And so it's something that as we are walking our Christian walk and we are in this communication with God, is that we learn to recognize God's voice. We learn to recognize God's prompting in our life and his moving in our life and giving us direction, giving us insight, giving us just communicating with us, just like you would talk with your spouse or your friend. And so it's through that we understand not only what God's purpose is for in our life, but at the same time we learn to allow ourselves to rely on God for strength and for comfort, for encouragement. We can voice our opinions, our frustrations. We can ask for guidance. We can ask for wisdom. And it's all part of this communication that we have. And like I say here, this young Samuel, that had never heard God's voice before, and mistakenly thinking that it is Eli that's calling. And finally, he responds, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." And that's one thing I think that is so lacking in our prayer life, is that we don't take the time to stop and to listen. That our prayer life, when we do pray, is a one of one-sided. It's a one-sided, not really a conversation, but it's just like with the prayer of Jabez, that Lord bless me, expand my territory, give me more stuff, give me more money, give me more, give me more, give me more, and keep me out of trouble and keep me comfortable. And then once in a while, we might throw something in there, maybe for our kids, or if it's maybe if your church has observe like Pastor Appreciation Month or something like that, we might throw in a prayer for our pastor. And that seems to be the direction and the extent of our prayer life until we get into trouble, until we get into some type of storm in our life, and a lot of times by our own doing, our own decisions, because we've neglected to seek out God's direction or God's wisdom or God's direction, His counsel. And we get into something of our own doing, and then it doesn't turn out like that we desire, or there's something that is beyond our control. And when I use the word control, I'm referring to this illusion of control that we operate in, that we really have very little control. You know, I can make decisions and I can get myself into trouble. But a lot of times the things in our life that are truly of importance are beyond our control. What happens to me physically or health-wise may be beyond my control. And it's at those points that we tend to turn back to God. It's at those points that we tend to turn to God for direction and wisdom, and we've seen it all the way through the Jewish history, that they would follow and they would serve the Lord closely, that they would be observing His commands, and then they would get to the point that as God was blessing them, that they had it under control and they no longer needed God, and then they would begin to not necessarily turn away, but they would begin just slide away, or they would begin to, the relationship would break down. And they began to do things on their own in their own wisdom, and so they would neglect the things of the Lord. They would neglect His commands, and then they would get to a point in their a generation that knew not God, and at that point, then God would discipline them. Why? Because He loved them, and just like a parent disciplines a child, so God would discipline them, and they would turn back, they would repent, and then they would begin the cycle, if you will, all over again. And so that's where it's a typical picture of even us as the American Christians, that as long as things are going well, and as long as we're operating under God's blessing and our life is going well, then we want to be in control and we love being comfortable. But when things happen that are beyond our control, or things are begin to get chaotic in our life, that's when we typically turn back then to God. And again, it's this prayer of Jabez, Lord, I want you to bless me. I want you to expand my things. I want more things. I want you to keep me away from pain and trouble, and I want to be comfortable. rather than maintaining this relationship that we have with God. So I want to encourage you that a listening relationship should be our focus as Christians, and that as we are in our prayer life, that we have this moment, or we set aside enough time that we can listen for God's voice, just like Samuel did. Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening, and that listening becomes part of our relationship. Listening becomes part of our communication that we have with God. And so what is it that God is communicating? What is it that God speaks to us about? Well, it can be anything that's going on in our life, what He has planned for us, what He has prepared for us, and at the same time what He has prepared us for. And I believe as we grow and as we mature, that those two things interconnect and interlock, and that we become, as we mature, that we become a vessel that God can employ for His work, His purpose. And His purpose, His mission is that, just like it was in the New Testament, is that the Word of the Lord, the knowledge of Jesus Christ, the knowledge of God, it goes forth, and we share that with people that are in our circle of influence, our neighbors, people that attend our church, people that we associate with at work or at school, or wherever our daily life takes us, that we have this relationship with God, and we share that wherever it is that we go. And as we begin to befriend people, and they'll notice a difference in your life. They'll notice a difference in your lifestyle, how you respond to situations, circumstances, how you spend your time, how you spend your money, your resources, your passion, your energy, what you're involved in, and just as importantly, what you're not involved in. And it's part of each generation then taking care to take this gospel of Jesus Christ into the next generation, and we're trying to expand the kingdom. And our life and our relationship with Jesus Christ is a necessary component of that. And that prayer life is something that it's so easy to neglect, but it's something that we have to guard against, something that we have to watch. And so I want to encourage you to maybe start out slow, maybe something that you do pray, but it's kind of hit or miss, and it's not something that you do on a regular basis, and it's just something that you do maybe as you feel the need when things are being chaotic or disruptive. And I want to encourage you to set time aside and get into the habit as you maybe do a daily devotional, as you get into His Word, as you read that, and as you study that, the prayer, this communication becomes part, and not only in this prayer of Jabez that Lord bless me and my family and expand my territory, but also, Lord, that speak to that your servant is listening, and take time enough to be quiet long enough that you can hear what God is leading you to do, directing you to do. And you'll find that as not only is He blessing what you're doing, but it's a blessing to you when you're involved with what He's doing and where He's blessing. And I'm glad you could join me today. Hope something that was said or scripture, something that speaks to your spirit. God bless you.